Richard Hale had $10 billion, a penthouse that touched the clouds, and an empire that spanned the globe. Yet when he looked in the mirror that October night, he saw only emptiness staring back. The champagne tasted like ash, the applause sounded hollow, and the golden life he'd built suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated prison. So Richard Hale, one of America's most powerful billionaires, made a decision that would leave Wall Street speechless. He gave it all away, every last penny, and walked in the night with nothing but a backpack. The world called him insane, his daughter called him lost, and the media called it the most spectacular fall from grace in corporate history. But on the frozen streets, where survival was currency and dignity was luxury, Richard was about to meet a 12-year-old boy named Jamal who would teach him that perhaps he hadn't fallen at all. Perhaps he was finally learning how to rise. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The crystal chandeliers cast diamond patterns across the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom. Richard Hale stood at the podium, his tailored Armani suit fitting him like a second skin, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. Before him, 500 of the city's most influential people applauded as the massive screen behind him revealed architectural renderings of his latest achievement, a 70-story glass tower that would reshape the skyline. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been told no. The Hale Tower represents more than steel and glass. It represents progress, innovation, and the future of this city. The applause swelled. Cameras flashed. Richard smiled, that practice smile he'd perfected over 30 years of board meetings and press conferences. At 52, he commanded the room with the ease of someone who owned not just buildings, but entire city blocks. His net worth had crossed $10 billion last quarter, making him one of the 100 richest people in America. As he stepped away from the podium, accepting congratulations from mayors and senators, his face remained composed. He shook hands firmly, made appropriate small talk about market projections and urban development. But behind his steel-gray eyes, something flickered, a hollowness that no amount of applause could fill. Later that evening, the elevator to his penthouse climbed silently through 60 floors of his own building. The doors opened directly into his living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that real estate agents would call priceless. Richard loosened his tie and walked to the bar, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He stood before the window, staring at his reflection superimposed over the glittering cityscape. The man looking back at him wore success like armor, but underneath, Richard saw something else. He saw emptiness. "What's it all for?" he whispered to his reflection. The penthouse absorbed his words into its vast silence. 10,000 square feet of marble, chrome, and loneliness. His mind drifted backward, uninvited, to a cramped apartment in Detroit. He was 8 years old again, watching his mother count coins at the kitchen table while his father came home with grease under his fingernails from another double shift at the factory. They'd eaten beans and rice for dinner 3 nights that week. His mother had smiled and called it an adventure, but Richard had seen her crying when she thought he was asleep. The memory stung. He'd built an empire to never feel that helplessness again, to never watch someone he loved struggle to make ends meet. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost everyone he was supposed to protect. The sound of heels on marble yanked him back to the present. He turned to find his daughter, Sarah, standing in his foyer. She must have used her key, the one he'd given her 3 years ago that she'd never used until tonight. "Congratulations, Dad," she said, her voice carrying no warmth. At 28, she looked like her mother. Dark hair, sharp features, eyes that saw too much. Another tower, another billion, another victory. "Sarah, I didn't know you were coming to the gala." "I wasn't. I came to return this." She placed the key on the marble counter. "I saw the news coverage. All those people praising you, calling you a visionary. Do you know what Mom called you before she died?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Sarah, lost. She said you were lost, and she was tired of waiting for you to find your way back." Sarah's eyes glistened, but didn't spill over. She'd inherited his ability to hold everything inside. "Money can't buy love, Dad." It can't buy back the years you missed, the recitals, the graduations, the nights mom needed you and got your assistant instead. I was building something. You were building walls. And now you're alone inside them. She turned toward the elevator. Goodbye, Richard. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, taking his daughter away perhaps for the last time. Richard stood in his palace of glass and steel, the whiskey trembling in his hand. Outside, the city pulsed with life, millions of people struggling, striving, surviving. And here he stood, above it all, feeling nothing but the weight of his daughter's absence. The next morning came too soon. Richard hadn't slept. He'd spent the night walking through his penthouse, really seeing it for the first time in years. The Monet in the hallway. When had he last actually looked at it? The sculpture by the entrance. Did he even remember the artist's name? Each piece had been acquired not for love of art, but as an investment, another asset in his portfolio. He dressed mechanically and descended to the lobby. Outside the building's entrance, a homeless man sat against the wall, a cardboard sign beside him reading Veteran. Anything helps. The man looked up as Richard passed, their eyes meeting for a moment. The homeless man's face was weathered, creased by sun and hardship, but his eyes held something Richard recognized: dignity fighting against despair. Richard reached for his wallet, then hesitated. The man spit on the ground near Richard's Italian leather shoes. You built glass towers but left us with nothing, the man said, his voice gravelly. You, and your kind, reaching for heaven while we scrape in hell. The words shouldn't have affected him. Richard had heard criticism before, from activists, from journalists, from competitors. But standing there in his $1,000 shoes, looking at a man who had nothing, the words cut deep. He pulled out a $100 bill and held it out. The homeless man laughed bitterly. Keep it. It won't wash the blood off. Richard's hand remained extended for a moment before he slowly returned the bill to his wallet. He walked to his waiting car, but the man's words followed him. Blood. What blood? The blood of the poor? The forgotten? Those crushed beneath the wheels of progress? The boardroom of Hale Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of his newest acquisition. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table, watching his executives argue about quarterly projections. David Kellerman, his CFO, was particularly animated, his face red as he pounded the table. We need to cut costs by 15%. I suggest we start with the employee health benefits. We're spending too much on keeping our workers healthy. Richard interrupted, his voice quiet. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. It's business, Richard, David said carefully. We have shareholders to think about. Shareholders. Richard repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. Tell me, David, when was the last time you worried about paying for your medication? Or choosing between rent and medical bills? Richard, are you feeling all right? This from Margaret Foster, his head of development. You seem different. Different. Yes, he was different. The homeless man's words echoed in his head. The image of his daughter's back as she walked away. His mother counting coins at a kitchen table in Detroit. I'm fine, he said, standing. Continue without me. He left them there, mouths agape, and walked to his office. Through the window, he could see the entire city spread below. Somewhere down there, that homeless veteran was still sitting against a wall. Somewhere down there, thousands of people were struggling to survive while he sat in his tower, debating how to extract more profit from their labor. That night, he walked through his penthouse again. He stopped in his garage, looking at his collection of cars, a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, a vintage Rolls-Royce. Combined, they were worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. He ran his hand along the Ferrari's hood, feeling nothing. They were just metal and leather, expensive toys for a man who'd forgotten how to play. In his home office, he pulled out photo albums he hadn't opened in years. There he was with his wife, Emma, on their wedding day. She'd been radiant, and he'd been young and hungry, full of dreams about the empire he would build. There was Sarah as a baby, then a toddler, then a child holding a trophy from a science fair he hadn't attended. The last photo was of Emma in the hospital, days before the cancer took her. Even then, ravaged by disease, she'd been beautiful. She'd held his hand and made him promise to live, really live, not just exist. He'd promised. That was 4 years ago. He'd broken that promise every single day since. The decision, when it came, felt like exhaling after holding his breath for decades. Richard picked up his phone and called his lawyer, James Morrison, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "James, I need you to draw up papers." "What kind of papers?" "Liquidation papers. I'm selling everything. Every asset, every property, every investment." Silence on the other end. Then, "Richard, have you been drinking?" "I've never been more sober in my life. I want to create a foundation, anonymous, untraceable to me. Every penny goes into it." "Richard, we're talking about billions of dollars. Your entire life's work." "No," Richard said quietly. "My life's work was supposed to be my family. This was just a distraction that got out of hand." It took 3 days to convince James he was serious. The boardroom meeting where he announced his decision was chaos. David Kellerman actually stood up and shouted that Richard had lost his mind. Margaret Foster threatened legal action. Investors called frantically, certain this was some kind of hostile takeover or elaborate tax scheme. Richard sat through it all with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He signed paper after paper, transferring ownership, liquidating assets, watching his empire dissolve into numbers that would be transferred to a foundation that would help people he'd never meet. "You're destroying everything we built," David screamed. "No," Richard replied. "I'm finally building something that matters." On his last night in the penthouse, Richard packed a small backpack. A few changes of clothes, basic toiletries, nothing more. He looked around one final time at the temple to wealth he'd constructed. Tomorrow, new owners would take possession. Tomorrow, Richard Hale the billionaire would cease to exist. He walked through the lobby at dawn, nodding to the security guard who looked confused to see him with a backpack. Outside, the city was just waking up. The homeless veteran was in his usual spot. "You again," the man said. Richard sat down beside him, placing his backpack on the ground. "Yeah, me again, but different this time." The man studied him for a long moment. "You look lighter." Richard smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one from boardrooms. "I am. I finally am." The first night hit Richard harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. After leaving his building, he'd walk for hours, his backpack growing heavier with each block. The city he'd viewed from penthouse windows revealed itself in intimate, brutal detail. Broken streetlights created pools of darkness where shapes moved and whispered. The smell of urine and rotting garbage replaced the filtered air he'd breathed for decades. He finally chose a bench in Morrison Park, a place he'd once donated a fountain to. The bronze plaque with his name was covered in graffiti now. He sat down and immediately felt the cold seep through his jeans, designer jeans that seemed absurd in this context. The bench's wooden slats were warped, creating gaps that bit into his back. A group of young men walked by, their eyes scanning him with predatory interest. One of them slowed. "Hey, old man, that's Kenny's bench." Richard stood quickly, his body remembering boardroom power, moves that meant nothing here. "I didn't know. Now you do. Move." He grabbed his backpack and walked away, their laughter following him. Power, he realized, was contextual. His name had once moved mountains. Here, it couldn't even secure a bench. He found another spot under a bridge where the concrete was dry. 3 other people were already there, wrapped in blankets and cardboard. They watched him with suspicious eyes as he tried to make himself comfortable on the ground. The concrete was harder than he'd imagined, seeming to pull heat from his body. Around 2 a.m., the hunger started. His last meal had been breakfast in his penthouse, organic eggs and artisanal toast that he'd barely touched. Now his stomach cramped and growled. He'd walked past a dozen restaurants earlier, their windows glowing warm, the smell of food making his mouth water. But he'd given away everything. The $20 in his pocket was all he had, and some instinct told him to save it. By dawn, he couldn't stand it anymore. He watched a man in a suit throw half a sandwich in a trash can near a bus stop. Richard waited until the man was gone, then approached the can. His hand hovered over the opening. Inside, he could see the sandwich sitting on top of a newspaper. It looked fresh, barely touched. He reached in, his fingers touching the bread, then jerked back as if burned. A woman with a small child was watching him from across the street. The child pointed, and the mother quickly pulled him away. Richard's face burned with shame, but his stomach hurt worse. He grabbed the sandwich and walked quickly away, finding an alley where he could eat unseen. The sandwich was turkey and Swiss, probably from the deli he used to send his assistant to. It tasted like humiliation and necessity. He gagged on the first bite, not from the taste, but from what the act represented. By the third bite, hunger won over pride. Days blurred together in a haze of survival. Richard learned the geography of need, which restaurants threw out food at what times, which security guard would look the other way, which corners to avoid after dark. His clothes grew dirty, then rank. He could smell himself, a sharp, sour odor that made people step away from him on sidewalks. On his fourth day, he decided to try panhandling. He'd seen others do it, holding cups or hats, sometimes with signs. He positioned himself near a subway entrance during morning rush hour, his head down, fighting every instinct that screamed this was beneath him. "Excuse me, could you spare? Get a job." A woman snapped without looking at him. The irony almost made him laugh. He'd created thousands of jobs, had been featured on magazine covers as a job creator. Now, he couldn't even get someone to look him in the eye. An hour yielded $3.47. One man had thrown change at his feet rather than placing it in his outstretched hand, the coins scattering on the sidewalk. Richard had crawled on his knees to collect them while commuters stepped around him like he was debris. The street hierarchy revealed itself quickly. There were territories, unspoken rules, and consequences for breaking them. A man called Boxer controlled the area under the bridge where Richard had first tried to sleep. Two women, Maria and Janet, had claimed to the best spot behind the grocery store where employees sometimes left out day-old bread. Richard learned this the hard way when he unknowingly sat in Maria's spot to eat a bruised apple he'd found. "You're sitting in my office," Maria said. She was probably 60, wearing 3 coats despite the moderate weather, her gray hair matted into clumps. "I'm sorry, I didn't." "Nobody knows nothing when they first fall," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But you learn or you don't last. How long you been out?" "Few days." She laughed, showing gaps where teeth should be. "Days? Boy, you still smell like the inside. Give a month. Then you'll know if you're built for this or not." She was right about the smell. After a week without a shower, Richard's own odor became a constant companion. He tried washing in public restroom sinks, but security guards chased him out. He found a fountain in a park and tried to clean himself at night. But the police arrived, flashlights turning the water drops into diamonds before they ordered him to move along. "This isn't a bathtub, buddy. Move it or we book you for public indecency." The younger officer looked fresh, maybe 25, with clean skin and pressed uniform. Richard wanted to tell him that he'd once donated $100,000 to the police benevolent fund. Instead, he gathered his increasingly dirty clothes and shuffled away. The physical danger came on day 10. Richard had found a good spot to sleep, a loading dock behind an abandoned store. He just started to doze when hands grabbed him, pulling him to his feet. 3 men, all younger and stronger, went through his backpack while one held him against the wall. "Nothing good," one said, tossing aside his spare clothes. "Check his pockets." They found his $20, now reduced to $12 after necessary purchases. One of them punched him in the stomach, more from disappointment than malice. Richard doubled over, gasping, tasting bile. "Waste of time," the leader said, and they left him there, his belongings scattered on the ground. Richard collected his things slowly, his ribs aching. His backpack was torn now, the zipper broken. He tied it closed with a piece of string he found and limped away, looking for somewhere safer. But safety, he was learning, was a luxury the homeless couldn't afford. The shelter seemed like salvation when he finally swallowed his pride enough to try it. The Mercy House on 3rd Avenue had a reputation for being cleaner than most, with hot meals and actual beds. Richard arrived at 4 p.m. when he'd heard they opened their doors. The line was already around the block. Men and women of every age, some with children, some talking to invisible companions, some silent and hollow-eyed. Richard took his place at the end, trying not to think about the charity galas he'd attended in ballrooms, writing checks to places like this without ever imagining he'd stand in their line. By the time he reached the door, a large man with kind eyes was shaking his head. "Sorry, brother. We're full up. Try again tomorrow, but come earlier. We fill up fast when it's supposed to rain." Zen. Richard looked up at the darkening sky, seeing clouds he'd never noticed from climate-controlled environments. "Please, I just need. Everyone needs, friend. Tomorrow. 3:30 if you want a real shot." The door closed with a finality that Richard recognized. He'd closed plenty of doors himself, on deals, on opportunities, on people. Now he stood on the wrong side, understanding for the first time what it felt like to have hope shut in your face. It did rain that night. Richard huddled in a doorway, his jacket pulled over his head, water still finding ways to soak through. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. He thought about his penthouse's heated floors, the rain pattering against windows he'd never had to feel. He thought about Sarah, wondering if she was dry and warm somewhere, if she ever thought about him. Was I a fool to give it all up? He muttered to his reflection in a puddle. The man looking back was unrecognizable, hollow cheeks covered in patchy beard, eyes sunken, hair matted and dirty. He looked like someone he would have once stepped around on the sidewalk. The next morning, exhausted and shivering, Richard sat on a curb trying to warm himself in the weak sun. His stomach had moved past hunger into a constant, dull ache. He watched people hurry past on their way to jobs, to homes, to lives that made sense. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a young black boy, maybe 12 years old, wearing a backpack that had seen better days. The boy held out half a sandwich wrapped in napkin. "You look like you need this more than me," the boy said. Richard stared at the sandwich, then at the boy. The kid's shoes had holes in them. His jacket was too small, the sleeves ending inches above his wrists. This child, who clearly had almost nothing, was offering to share. Thank you," Richard managed, his voice cracking. The boy shrugged. "We gotta look out for each other out here. Nobody else will." He walked away before Richard could say anything else, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians. Richard held the sandwich like it was made of gold, tears threatening to spill. In all his years of deal-making, of moving millions with a signature, he'd never felt anything as profound as this moment, a poor child sharing half a sandwich with a broken stranger. He ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but what it represented. Perhaps he hadn't lost everything after all. Perhaps he was finally finding something he'd never known existed, the invisible threads that connected the forgotten, the discarded, the ones who lived in the shadows of towers built by men like he used to be. As the sun climbed higher, Richard stood and began walking again, but something had shifted. He wasn't just a fallen billionaire anymore. He was part of something else now, something he didn't yet understand but desperately wanted to learn. The city looked different through hungry eyes. The boy from yesterday found Richard again 3 days later, sitting against the same brick wall where desperation had become his only companion. This time, the child wasn't carrying food, but instead wore a knowing look that seemed far too mature for his 12 years. "You're still here," the boy observed, adjusting his worn backpack. "Most new folks don't last this long. They either find their way back to wherever they came from, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Richard understood. "Or they disappeared into the statistics nobody wanted to count." "I don't have anywhere to go back to," Richard said, his voice rough from days of barely speaking. The boy studied him with dark brown eyes that held a sharpness Richard recognized, the kind that came from seeing too much too young. "I'm Jamal," he said finally. "Jamal Washington." "Richard? Just Richard? No last name?" Richard hesitated. Hale meant nothing here. Might even be dangerous if someone recognized it. "Just Richard." Jamal snorted. "You new out here? You don't walk like the rest." He demonstrated, adopting the shuffling gait Richard had seen in long-time homeless people, shoulders curved inward, eyes down, but somehow watching everything. "You walk like you're still somebody." "I'm nobody," Richard said, and for the first time, it felt like truth rather than self-pity. "Everybody's somebody," Jamal corrected. "Just some people forget it." "Come on," Richard with no last name. "Let me show you something." Richard struggled to his feet, his body protesting. Sleeping on concrete had introduced him to pains he didn't know existed. Jamal waited patiently, not offering help, but not walking away either, a balance of respect and practicality. They walked 6 blocks to a small church Richard had passed dozens of times in his former life without ever noticing. Jamal led him around to the back where a basement entrance was propped open. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Jamal explained. Free breakfast, no questions asked. Sister Patricia runs it. She's good people. Won't preach at you or make you pray for your eggs. Inside, about 30 people sat at folding tables, eating scrambled eggs and toast. The smell made Richard's stomach clench with need. Jamal grabbed 2 plates and handed one to Richard. Rich guys don't last long out here, Jamal said as they sat down, unknowingly hitting closer to the truth than he knew. Saw one once, lost everything in the crash back in '08. He kept trying to tell everyone who he used to be, like it mattered. Like anybody cared. What happened to him? Jamal shrugged, shoveling eggs into his mouth. Dunno. Probably went crazy or got himself hurt. You can't live in yesterday out here. Only today counts. Richard ate slowly, watching Jamal interact with others. The boy seemed to know everyone, nodding to an elderly woman, fist-bumping a man with one arm, sliding an extra piece of toast to a woman who looked barely older than Sarah. You know everyone, Richard observed. I pay attention. That's how you survive. Mrs. Chun over there. She shares her medicine sometimes when people need antibiotics. Tommy, the guy with the beard. He knows all the safe spots to sleep on the south side. Information is currency when money ain't an option. After breakfast, Jamal showed Richard his world. They walked through alleys Richard hadn't known existed, past camps hidden behind dumpsters, through a network of survival invisible to the city above. See that corner? Jamal pointed to an intersection where well-dressed people waited for the light. Thursday afternoons, this tech company does their fire drills. They leave the building for 20 minutes, and the cleaning crew always props the service door open. Bathrooms right inside, real soap, hot water, paper towels. Richard watched the boy navigate this shadow world with the confidence of a CEO in a boardroom. How long have you been doing this? On and off since I was 8. Mom gets sick sometimes, can't work. I learned to fill the gaps. Your mother, she's homeless too? Jamal's face hardened. We got a place. Section 8 housing over on Riverside. It ain't much, but it's ours. I'm not homeless. I just know how to move in both worlds. That evening, curiosity and something else, concern maybe, made Richard follow Jamal. The boy walked 20 blocks to a rundown apartment building that seemed to lean against its neighbors for support. Richard watched from across the street as Jamal used a key to enter, saw a light come on in a third-floor window. Through the thin curtain, Richard could make out shapes. Jamal helping a woman from a bed to a chair, a smaller figure, maybe a younger sister, bringing something that might have been medicine. The tableau of caregiving played out in shadow form, and Richard felt like a voyeur watching something sacred. He turned to leave and found Jamal standing behind him. Following me? The boy asked, his voice carrying an edge. I was worried. I don't need your worry. My family doesn't need your pity. It's not pity, Richard said, surprising himself with the truth of it. It's respect. Jamal studied him for a long moment. My mom's got lupus. Bad kidneys too. Some days are better than others. Today's not a good day. How do you manage? Medical bills, rent, food. Same way everybody does. One day at a time, one problem at a time. Mom gets disability sometimes when they don't find some reason to cut it off. I pick up cans, do odd jobs. Keisha, that's my sister. She's 8, smart as anything. She needs to stay in school, so I make sure she can. Richard thought of the thousands he used to spend on lunch meetings, the millions moved with casual signatures. You're 12 years old. Age doesn't matter when bills come due. They walked back toward the city center together, Jamal teaching without meaning to. He showed Richard how to layer cardboard for insulation, how to tell which coffee shops would let you use their bathroom without buying anything, how to spot undercover cops who like to roust homeless camps for fun. Why are you helping me? Richard asked as they settled under an overpass for the night. Because somebody helped me once, Jamal said. Old man named Eugene. White guy, actually. Veteran. He taught me the rules when Mom first got sick, and I had to figure things out. He died last winter, pneumonia. I figure I owe it forward. Richard wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the gift this child was giving him. Instead, he managed only, "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You still got to learn to survive." Knowing and doing are different things. The next days proved Jamal right. Richard failed at almost everything. He spilled the soup at the community kitchen, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He fumbled with the cardboard, unable to create the insulating layers Jamal demonstrated. When they collected cans for recycling, Richard missed half of them, not seeing the hiding spots Jamal spotted instantly. "Man, you really weren't ever poor, were you?" Jamal laughed one afternoon as Richard struggled to tie a tarp over their sleeping area. "No," Richard admitted. "Never poor. Shows. You don't know how to stretch anything." "Look," Jamal retied the knot, using less rope but creating better tension. "Everything's got to do double duty out here. Waste nothing, assume nothing." They were sharing old donuts from a bakery dumpster when Jamal said quietly, "You've done more with nothing than I ever did with everything." Richard meant it. This 12-year-old boy managed his mother's medication schedule, kept his sister in school, found food and shelter, and still had enough compassion to help a stranger. Richard had managed billion-dollar portfolios, but couldn't manage to keep his own family together. "That's stupid," Jamal said, but his cheeks darkened slightly with embarrassment. "You don't know what I'd do with money. Probably waste it on stupid stuff." "I don't think so. I think you take care of people. That's what money's for, isn't it? Taking care of people." The simple truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd spent decades accumulating wealth, telling himself it was for security, for family, for legacy. But when had he ever just taken care of people? Their bond solidified the day 3 older teens cornered Richard behind shopping center. They wanted his shoes, decent boots that hadn't quite worn through yet. Richard tried to explain he needed them, but talking had never solved this kind of problem. "Leave him alone." Jamal appeared, all 4 feet and 10 inches of him, facing down boys twice his size. "Or what, little man?" The leader laughed. "You gonna stop us?" "No, but Tommy will. And Mrs. Chun. And Sister Patricia when she finds out you're robbing people on her breakfast line." The leader's smile faded. "You threatening to snitch?" "I'm explaining consequences. You take his shoes, you're marking yourself as someone who preys on the weak. Nobody shares information with predators. Nobody warns you when the cops sweep. Nobody saves you a spot or shares their score. You become nobody." It was a masterful negotiation, using social capital as leverage. The teens backed off, grumbling threats, but ultimately unwilling to risk their standing in the homeless community's delicate ecosystem. "You stood up for me," Richard said after they left. "You'd do the same for me." "Would I?" Richard wondered aloud. "I don't know if I've ever stood up for anyone but myself." Jamal gave him a strange look. "You're here, aren't you? On the streets when you could probably be somewhere else. That's standing up for something." If only the boy knew how right he was. The morning rain turned the shelter in trance into a muddy river of desperation. Richard and Jamal stood in line together, Jamal bouncing on his toes to stay warm while Richard hunched against the cold. They'd been waiting since 4 a.m., and the doors wouldn't open for another hour. "They got extra beds tonight," Jamal explained. "Church donation means they can take 40 instead of 25. When the doors finally opened, the line moved with practiced efficiency. The intake worker, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, checked Richard in without issue. But when Jamal stepped forward, her expression changed. "Jamal Washington? You were flagged last week for the disruption in the dining hall." "That wasn't me," Jamal protested. "That was Marcus. We don't even look alike. Rules are rules. You're on the banned list for 30 days. Richard stepped forward. "There must be a mistake. He's just a kid. It's freezing tonight." The woman's expression softened slightly, but remained firm. "I am sorry. Once someone's on the list, I can't override it. He'll have to find somewhere else." "Then I'm not staying either," Richard said. "Man, don't be stupid," Jamal hissed. "Take the bed. We stick together." They walked away from the warm shelter, Jamal muttering about foolish pride while secretly looking pleased. They found shelter under a loading dock, huddled together for warmth. Richard noticed how the cold affected the boy differently. Jamal seemed to shrink into himself, conserving energy like a small animal preparing for hibernation. This happen often? Richard asked. Being turned away for things you didn't do. Black kid in torn clothes? Yeah, it happens. You get used to it. That's not right. Jamal laughed bitterly. Right and wrong don't mean much when you're at the bottom. You should know that by now. But Richard was learning that right and wrong meant more at the bottom, not less. Every small injustice carried heavier consequences when you had no cushion to absorb the blow. The next day, they tried to get day labor at a construction site. The foreman looked them over, his eyes lingering on Jamal with obvious distaste. I'll take the old guy. Kid can't work here, liability issues. I'm stronger than I look, Jamal said. I can carry. Don't care. Insurance doesn't cover minors. Old guy, you want the work or not? Richard looked at Jamal, who nodded. Take it. We need the money. The work was brutal. Richard had to move concrete blocks from one side of the site to the other, each one seeming to weigh more than the last. His soft hands blistered within the first hour. By lunch, he could barely lift his arms. The younger workers laughed at his weakness, making bets on when he'd quit. He thought about quitting a dozen times. His back screamed, his hands bled through the work gloves, and his legs shook with exhaustion. But each time he wanted to stop, he pictured Jamal waiting outside the fence, trusting him to last the day. When 5 p.m. finally came, the foreman handed him $40, less than minimum wage but cash with no questions asked. Richard's hands shook too badly to count it. Jamal was waiting where he'd left him, having spent the day collecting cans. He'd made $3. You look terrible, Jamal observed, taking in Richard's sweat-soaked clothes and trembling limbs. Feel worse. But you finished. Barely. Jamal helped him walk to a bench where Richard collapsed. The boy counted their combined earnings, $43. Enough for food and maybe some basic medical supplies for Jamal's mother. We should get you some bandages for those hands, Jamal said. I'm fine. No, you're not. And if your hands get infected, you can't work. Then we're both screwed. The practical wisdom of it struck Richard again. Every decision had to be strategic when resources were limited. They found a pharmacy where Jamal somehow convinced the clerk to give them expired antibiotic cream for half price. As Jamal carefully bandaged Richard's hands with a gentleness that belied his tough exterior, he said quietly, Don't let them see you beg too hard. What? Today at the site, I watched through the fence. When you were hurting, you kept asking the foreman for breaks. It made you look weak. You got to keep your head up, even when it's empty. Dignity is sometimes all we got. Richard thought about all the times he'd made people beg for loans, for jobs, for second chances. He'd enjoyed the power of making others humble themselves before him. Now, positions reversed, he understood the cost of dignity, surrendered. They were walking back to their usual spot when a familiar sight made Richard freeze. A black limousine idled at a red light, its windows tinted, but not enough to hide the occupants from someone who knew to look. David Kellerman sat in the back, laughing at something on his phone. Margaret Foster was beside him, champagne flute in hand. Richard pulled his hood up and turned away, but not before catching a glimpse of papers spread on the seat between them. Architectural plans with the Hale Industries logo still visible. You know them? Jamal asked, noticing his reaction. Used to. Rich folks. Very. They know you're out here? No. And they wouldn't care if they did. Jamal watched the limo pull away, then looked at Richard with those two knowing eyes. You were like them once. That's why you walk different. Richard didn't deny it. Does it matter? Depends. You trying to go back to that? Never. Then no, it doesn't matter. That night, they returned to find their campsite destroyed. The cardboard shelter they'd built, their stored blankets, Jamal's small stash of canned goods, all gone. Other homeless people avoided eye contact, which told Richard this wasn't random. Someone had targeted them specifically. Jamal stood staring at the wreckage, his hands clenched into fists. For the first time since Richard had met him, the boy looked his age, young and overwhelmed. 3 weeks of collecting, Jamal said quietly. I had medicine saved for Mom. $40 worth. Richard felt rage building his chest, unfamiliar and hot. Not the cold anger of boardroom betrayals, but something primal. Who did this? Doesn't matter. It does matter. This is theft. We should. What? Call the cops. Jamal laughed bitterly, tears threatening to spill. They'd arrest us for illegal camping before they'd care about our stuff being stolen. The injustice of it overwhelmed Richard. He wanted to fix this, to make it right, but he had no power here. No lawyers to call, no influence to leverage. Just an old man with bandaged hands and a 12-year-old boy trying not to cry over lost medicine. "I'm sorry," Richard said, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. "Not your fault. Maybe it is. Maybe they targeted you because of me. New guy, older, white. Maybe I made you target." Jamal wiped his eyes roughly. "Stop it. This happens. It's just the game. We start over, build again. That's what we do. But your mother's medicine. I'll figure it out. I always do." They spent the night rebuilding with salvage materials, working in silence. Around midnight, a woman approached, one Richard had seen around but never spoken to. She handed Jamal a small bag. "Heard what happened," she said simply. "It's not much, but there's some antibiotics in there. Should help your mama." After she left, Jamal explained that Sandra, her son, died from an infection 2 years ago. She shares medicine when she can. People take care of each other out here. More than they did where you came from. Richard thought about his former life, the careful alliances and calculated relationships. Much more. A week later, they encountered the group that had destroyed their camp. 3 men who controlled a section of the underpass through intimidation. They cornered Richard and Jamal behind a grocery store, demanding rent for existing in their territory. "We don't have anything," Jamal said steadily. "Then you better find something," the leader said, shoving Jamal backward. Richard stepped between them. "Leave the kid alone." The punch came fast, dropping Richard to his knees. The second one split his lip, but he stayed between them and Jamal, taking the blows meant for the boy. When they finally got bored and left, Richard could barely see through his swelling eyes. "Why'd you do that?" Jamal demanded, helping him sit up. "I could take a beating. No 12-year-old should have to. That's not how it works out here. Maybe it should be." They made their way to the free clinic, where they waited 6 hours to be seen. The doctor, harried and exhausted, barely looked at them as he prescribed painkillers Richard couldn't afford and suggested ice he had no way to keep frozen. Sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by the sick and desperate, Richard watched Jamal help an elderly man fill out forms, translate for a Spanish-speaking family, share his last granola bar with a pregnant teenager. The boy moved through this world of need like a veteran medic on a battlefield, doing what he could with what little he had. "You have the heart of a leader," Richard told him as they walked back. Jamal snorted. "Leaders got followers. I'm just trying to survive." "No, you're trying to help everyone survive. That's different. Maybe I needed to lose it all to learn what you already know," Richard said one evening as they shared a can of soup heated over a trash can fire. "What I know, that wealth isn't about what you have. It's about what you share." Jamal considered this, stirring the soup thoughtfully. "My mom used to say something like that, before she got too sick. She said being rich in spirit was better than being rich in pocket. Your mother sounded wise. She was a teacher, elementary school. Before." Jamal's voice carried a weight of loss that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. Richard wanted a promise that things would get better, that Jamal's mother would recover, that the boy would have the childhood he deserved. But those were promises he couldn't keep, and Jamal would know they were lies. Instead, he said, "You're going to be something special, Jamal Washington." "I'm already something special," the boy replied with a grin. "I am surviving." The newspaper was already 2 days old when Richard found it, soggy from rain, but still readable enough to make his stomach drop. The business section's headline screamed in bold letters, "Hale Industries posts record profits under new leadership." He sat on the curb, spreading the damn pages carefully while Jamal sorted through recycling bins nearby. The article detailed how David Kellerman, now CEO, had streamlined operations and cut costs to achieve a 40% increase in quarterly profits. The cost-cutting measures were listed like achievements: reduced employee benefits, elimination of pension matching, closure of 2 factories in Michigan. 3,000 jobs gone. "You okay?" Jamal asked. noticing Richard's stillness. Richard held up the paper. The world moves on, with or without us. Jamal glanced at the headline without much interest. Rich people getting richer. What else is new? If only the boy knew he was looking at Richard's former empire, now thriving in his absence. The foundation he'd created was mentioned only in passing. A footnote about former CEO Richard Hale's mysterious disappearance and liquidation of assets. They'd moved on from him in less than 2 months. That afternoon, while waiting in line at the food bank, Richard saw her. Sarah walked past on the opposite sidewalk, talking on her phone, dressed in a sharp business suit. She looked successful, confident, everything he'd once hoped she'd become. She was laughing at something, her face bright in a way he hadn't seen in years. Richard pulled his hood up and turned away, but not before catching sight of the man walking beside her. Tall, well-dressed, holding her hand. A ring glinted on her finger, an engagement ring he'd never know the story behind. "That's someone you know?" Jamal asked, following his gaze. "My daughter." Jamal's eyes widened. "You got family? Why aren't you with them?" "Because I spent 30 years choosing money over them. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late." "It's never too late. My mom says that. Sometimes it is, kid. Sometimes you break things so badly they can't be fixed." Sarah disappeared around a corner, taking with her any foolish hope Richard might have harbored about reconciliation. She was better off without him. Happier. 3 days later, the past collided with the present in the worst possible way. Richard and Jamal were sharing a bench outside a coffee shop, hoping to catch the Wi-Fi signal to check the weather on Jamal's ancient phone, when a familiar voice made Richard freeze. "Richard? Richard Hale." Thomas Brennan stood there in his $1,000 coat, looking like he'd seen a ghost. They'd been business partners once, had shared scotch and celebrated deals worth hundreds of millions. Richard met his eyes steadily. "Hello, Tom." Tom's gaze swept over Richard's dirty clothes, his unkempt beard, the homeless child beside him. His expression shifted from shock to disgust to something that might have been pity. "My God, the rumors were true. You really did lose your mind." "I found it, actually." Tom laughed uncomfortably, already backing away. "Sure, Richard. Sure." He pulled out his wallet, extracted a 20, and held it out like he was feeding a dangerous animal. "Here, get yourself a meal." "I don't want your money, Tom." "Right. Of course." Tom pocketed the bill quickly, relief evident on his face. "I should go. Meeting. You understand." He practically ran away, pulling out his phone before he'd gone 10 feet. Richard could hear him already spinning the story. "You'll never believe who I just saw." "Friend of yours?" Jamal asked dryly. "We used to do business together. I made him rich." "Doesn't seem too grateful." Gratitude is a luxury the wealthy can't afford. It implies debt. That night, they returned to their rebuilt camp to find it destroyed again, but this time with a message. Their blankets hadn't just been stolen, they'd been shredded. Their food supplies were scattered and contaminated with motor oil. Spray painted on the wall was a single word: leave. Jamal stood very still, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles went pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "I had Mom's heart medication in there. 20 pills. That was supposed to last 2 weeks." The pills were scattered in the oil-soaked dirt, ruined. Richard dropped to his knees, trying to salvage something, anything, but it was useless. Those pills cost $60 without insurance. It would take them weeks to save that much again. "I can't." Jamal's voice broke. "She needs those pills. Without them, her heart." For the first time since Richard had met him, Jamal started crying. Not the angry tears of frustration, but the deep, gasping sobs of a child who'd been asked to carry too much for too long. Richard pulled the boy against him, feeling the thin shoulders shake. "We'll figure it out. I promise." "How?" "We got nothing. We are nothing." "That's not true." "It is." Jamal pulled away, eyes blazing through tears. "You know what I heard today? They're closing the free clinic. Budget cuts. Where's Mom supposed to go now? Where are any of us supposed to go?" Richard had no answer. For all his former power, all his connections, he couldn't help this 12-year-old boy save his dying mother. "Maybe I should quit school," Jamal said quietly. Get a real job. Under the table somewhere. No. Richard's response was immediate and fierce. You're not dropping out. Then what? Watch her die. Watch Keisha go into foster care. At least if I'm working. If you drop out, you're trapped forever. No education, no future, just survival day after day until you can't anymore. Like you. Jamal shot back. The words stung because they were true. Richard was educated, experienced, formerly powerful, and none of it mattered here. But Jamal had something Richard had lost long ago. Potential unmarred by the corruption of wealth. If you walk away, Richard said slowly, then you are never different. Not from them. He was echoing Jamal's own words back to him. From weeks ago when Richard had considered giving up. The boy recognized them, his shoulders slumping. But what if trying isn't enough? Then at least we tried. They spent the night salvaging what they could, working in exhausted silence. Around dawn, Sandra appeared with a small bag. Heard about the medicine, she said simply, handing it to Jamal. It's only 5 pills, but it's the same kind. Should help until you can get more. After she left, Jamal stared at the pills in his palm. Why does she keep helping us? Because that's what people do when they remember what it means to be human. You rich people forget that. We forget everything except the numbers in our accounts. The crisis deepened 2 days later when they arrived at Jamal's apartment to find an eviction notice. They were 2 months behind on rent. Even subsidized housing required payment, and his mother's disability checks had been delayed again by bureaucratic red tape. Jamal's mother, Denise, was having a good day, lucid enough to understand what was happening. She was a small woman, made smaller by illness, but her eyes held the same strength Richard saw in her son. You must be Richard, she said, her voice weak but warm. Jamal talks about you. Mom don't. Says you're teaching him things. She studied Richard with those knowing eyes. What kind of things you teaching my boy? He's the one teaching me, ma'am. She smiled. That sound about right. My Jamal's always been the teacher. Even as a baby, watching everything, figuring out how things work. Mom, you should rest. I'll have time to rest soon enough. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Richard, can I ask you something? When I'm gone, will you watch out for them? Jamal and Keisha. Mom, stop. I'm not going anywhere, Richard said firmly. And neither are you. We're going to figure this out. But privately, he had no idea how. They needed $2,000 to stop the eviction. Might as well have been $2 million. That night, sitting outside the apartment building, Jamal was quiet for a long time before saying, maybe I was wrong. About what? About money not matching. It matters when you don't have it. It matters when people you love are dying because you can't afford to save them. Richard thought about the millions he'd casually spent on art he never looked at, cars he rarely drove, homes he never lived in. Money matters, he agreed. But what you do with it matters more. What good is that philosophy when we don't have any? Richard had no answer that wouldn't sound like hollow comfort from someone who'd chosen poverty rather than having it forced upon him. You gave it all up, didn't you? Jamal asked suddenly. You were rich, really rich, and you gave it away. Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. Why? Because I wanted to find meaning. Did you? Richard looked at the boy beside him, exhausted, worried, carrying burdens no child should bear, yet still fighting, still caring, still hoping. Yes, he said simply. I found it. Then you're an idiot, Jamal said, but there was affection in it. A good-hearted idiot, but still an idiot. Maybe, but I'd rather be your idiot friend than the empty man I was. Even if being my friend means watching my mom die because we can't afford medicine. Richard pulled the boy close. We're not going to let that happen. He didn't know how he'd keep that promise, but for the first time in his life, a promise mattered more than any deal he'd ever made. Winter arrived early that year, catching everyone unprepared. The first freeze came in late October, sending the homeless community scrambling for warm places. Richard woke to find frost on his beard and Jamal shivering beside him despite 3 layers of salvage clothing. We need to get inside today, Richard said, his breath visible in the cold air. Shelters are full, Jamal replied through chattering teeth. Been full since the temperature dropped. They made their way to the library, one of the few public spaces that didn't immediately chase out homeless people. But when they arrived, a new sign greeted them. Valid ID required for entry. Since when? Jamal demanded. The security guard, a young man who looked apologetic, shrugged. New policy. Had some problems last week. Richard still had his driver's license, though it felt like a relic from another life. But Jamal had nothing. What 12-year-old carried ID? He's with me, Richard said. Saw the... Everyone needs their own ID. Rules. They spent the day moving between businesses, staying just long enough to warm up before being asked to leave. By afternoon, both were exhausted from the constant movement, the vigilance required to avoid trouble. I know a place, Jamal finally said. But you're not going to like it. The place was a condemned building on the east side, officially empty, but actually housing dozens of desperate people. The smell hit Richard first, human waste, decay, and something chemical that burned his nostrils. People huddled in corners, some talking to invisible companions, others motionless in ways that made Richard wonder if they were still alive. We don't stay here long, Jamal whispered, just until we warm up. But warming up took hours in the concrete tomb of the building. They found a corner on the third floor, away from the worst of the chaos. Jamal pulled out a can of soup they'd been saving, but it was frozen solid. We could make a fire, Richard suggested, and burn the whole place down, or get arrested. No fires indoors, that's rule 1. So they ate the soup frozen, like a horrible popsicle, their bodies too cold to care about taste or texture. Richard watched Jamal struggle with the can, his small fingers blue with cold, and felt a rage he'd never experienced in his boardroom days. This wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. The next morning brought opportunity and humiliation in equal measure. A construction foreman recognized Richard from the previous job, offering him work for the day. You lasted longer than I expected last time, the man admitted. Job's yours if you want it. Richard took it immediately, but his body betrayed him. Weeks of malnutrition and sleeping on concrete had taken their toll. He dropped a load of pipes, narrowly missing another worker. His hands, still damaged from before, split open again. By lunch, the foreman pulled him aside. You're a liability out here, old man. Can't use you anymore. Please, I need this job, and I need workers who won't get someone killed. Here, he handed Richard $20. For the half day. Don't come back. Richard stood outside the chain-link fence, watching younger, stronger men work, earning money their families needed. Jamal found him there an hour later. Didn't work out? I'm too old. Too weak. You're not weak, Jamal said firmly. You're learning. There's a difference. The boy had spent his day collecting cans, making $3 and change. He also had news. Mom's worse. The 5 pills Sandra gave us aren't the right strength. She needs the real medication. They pooled their money, $23.47. The medication cost $60 without insurance. They were still far short. I could steal it, Jamal said quietly. No, just this once. She needs. If you get caught, you go into the system. Foster care. Your sister too. Then what happens to your mom? Jamal's face crumpled. Then what do I do? Just watch her die. We'll find another way. But Richard was running out of other ways. That night, while Jamal slept, he walked to a neighborhood he'd once known well, where his former colleagues lived in their brownstones and penthouses. He stood outside Tom Brennan's house, watching the warm light spill from windows, seeing the family move about inside. He could knock, beg. Tom might give him the money just to make him go away. But the thought of Jamal's words stopped him. Don't let them see you beg too hard. You got to keep your head up, even when it's empty. He walked away, dignity intact but problem unsolved. The next day brought a glimmer of hope. Sister Patricia at the church mentioned a new program, day labor specifically for older workers, with lighter duties and better protection. It's downtown, she explained. They're looking for people to do inventory work. Counting, sorting, that kind of thing. Richard arrived at 5 a.m. the next morning, finding a line already formed. When the doors opened at 7, he was hired immediately. His appearance might be rough, but he still spoke like an educated man, and that mattered for inventory work. The warehouse was massive, filled with electronics waiting to be cataloged. Richard's job was to scan barcodes and enter numbers into a system. Mindless work that his MBA from Harvard had never prepared him for, but he was grateful for it. "You're doing good," the supervisor said after a few hours. "Fast and accurate. You've done this before." "Something similar," Richard said, thinking of the thousands of reports he'd once reviewed without really seeing the human cost behind the numbers. He worked 10 hours, earning $80, more than he'd made in weeks. His body ached, but it was a different pain than construction, manageable. "There might be more work tomorrow," the supervisor said, if he wanted it. Richard practically ran back to find Jamal, eager to share the good news. But he found the boy sitting outside his apartment building, face streaked with tears. "She collapsed," Jamal said. Neighbors called 911. They took her to County General. They rushed to the hospital, where Denise lay unconscious, machines beeping around her. A hairy doctor explained that her heart was failing. Without consistent medication, the damage had accelerated. "We've stabilized her for now, but she needs regular treatment, medications, monitoring, possibly surgery eventually." "How much?" Jamal asked, his voice small. "With insurance." "We don't have insurance." The doctor's expression shifted. Then, significant. "Thousands, potentially tens of thousands." After the doctor left, Jamal stood by his mother's bed, holding her hand. Keisha was there too, brought by a neighbor, curled against her mother's side. "She's dying," Jamal said flatly, "and I can't save her." Richard wanted to promise everything would be okay, but the words died in his throat. Money, the thing he'd once had in excess, the thing he'd thrown away, was now the difference between life and death for someone who deserved to live. "I should have stayed in school today," Jamal muttered. "Should have been home." "This isn't your fault." "Whose fault is it then?" The boy's eyes blazed. "God's? The system's? Mine for not working harder." Before Richard could answer, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the doorway, they could see police officers talking to hospital security. "They're doing a sweep," someone whispered. "Looking for people who can't pay." It was probably paranoid thinking, but in their world, paranoid thinking kept you safe. Richard gathered Keisha while Jamal kissed his mother's forehead. "We'll be back, Mom," he whispered. "I promise." They slipped out through a different exit. 3 more refugees from a system that measured worth in dollars and cents. That night, huddled in their broken camp with Keisha between them for warmth, Jamal asked, "Why'd you give it all up?" "Really?" Richard considered lying, but the boy deserved truth. "Because I felt empty. Because my money couldn't buy what mattered. But it could have bought medicine. Could have saved people like my mom." "Yes. So you threw away the power to help people because you felt sad?" There was no judgment in the question, just a child trying to understand adult choices. "When you put it that way, it sounds foolish." Maybe it was. They sat in silence, watching their breath mist in the cold air. Finally, Jamal spoke again. "But you wouldn't have met us if you'd stayed rich." "No, and we wouldn't have had your help. So maybe things happen for reasons we don't understand." Richard pulled both children closer, sharing what warmth he had. "Your mom's going to make it. We'll find a way." "You keep saying that." "Because I have to believe it." "Belief doesn't pay bills," Jamal said, sounding decades older than 12. "No, but it keeps us going until we find what does." The next few days blurred together in a haze of work and worry. Richard got hired again at the warehouse, earning another $80. Jamal missed school to care for Keisha and visit his mother, who drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 4th day, Richard arrived at the warehouse to find a familiar face. David Kellerman was there with a team, apparently checking on a company Hale Industries had acquired. Richard pulled his cap low and turned away, but David's voice rang out. "You there?" The older gentleman. Richard turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the man who'd taken his company. David's face went white. "Richard? Jesus Christ, is that really you?" "Hello, David." David looked around nervously, then pulled Richard aside. "What are you doing here? The press said you disappeared. Maybe died." "I'm working." "Working? Here?" "Richard, this is insane. You're worth billions." "Was worth billions. I gave it all away, remember?" David's expression shifted from shock to something like disgust. "You really did lose your mind. Or found it." "Richard, come back." The board would do nothing. "I signed it all away. It's yours now, David. The company, the profits from those 3,000 jobs you cut. Enjoy it. David straightened his tie nervously. Those cuts were necessary. We have shareholders. I know the speech. I wrote it, remember? They stood there, two men who'd once shared power, now separated by more than circumstance. I could help you, David said finally. Loan you money, get you back on your feet. I'm on my feet. David looked at Richard's worn boots, his dirty clothes, the exhaustion written in every line of his face. This isn't you, Richard. This isn't who you are. You're right. The Richard Hale you knew would have stepped over dying children to make a profit. That man is dead. And what's left? This. David gestured at Richard's appearance. You're destroying yourself for what? Some misguided attempt at penance. I'm trying to save a boy's mother. I'm trying to keep a family together. I'm trying to matter. David shook his head. You've completely lost it. He pulled out his wallet, extracted several bills. Here, take this at least. Richard looked at the money, probably $500, pocket change to David, but enough to buy medicine, food, maybe even a night in a motel for Jamal and Keisha. His pride warred with necessity. Jamal's mother was dying. The children needed help. He took the money. David's expression mixed pity with contempt. The Richard Hale I knew would never have taken charity. The Richard Hale you knew never knew what it meant to need. David walked away, already pulling out his phone, no doubt to spread the story of Richard's fall. Richard didn't care. He had medicine to buy. The $500 from David Kellerman felt like blood money in Richard's pocket, but pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. He and Jamal stood in the pharmacy, counting pills into bottles while Keisha sat on the floor, quietly drawing in a notebook someone had donated to the shelter. That's enough heart medication for 2 weeks, the pharmacist said, her voice gentler than usual. She'd seen them before, knew their situation. But she really needs to be monitored by a doctor. We know, Jamal said quietly, pocketing the precious bottles. We're working on it. They'd paid the most urgent bills, medicine, some food, and a week's reprieve on the eviction by promising the landlord more was coming. The money was already nearly gone, but Denise was stable, and that was everything. At the hospital, she was awake, weak, but lucid. Her eyes filled with tears when Jamal showed her the medicine. How did you? Richard helped, Jamal said simply. He's been working. Denise turned her gaze to Richard, studying him with those eyes that seemed to see through everything. What kind of work? Warehouse inventory. It's steady, decent pay. He worked 10 hours straight yesterday, Jamal added proudly. And he's going back tomorrow. You don't have to do this, Denise said softly. We're not your responsibility. Yes, you are, Richard replied without hesitation. We're family now. The word hung in the air, powerful and fragile. Denise reached out her thin hand, and Richard took it, feeling the bird-like bones beneath paper-thin skin. Then God help you, she said with a weak smile. You picked a complicated family. The warehouse job became Richard's lifeline. Every morning at 5, he stood in line with other desperate men, mostly older, all hoping for a day's work. The supervisor, a man named Carl with kind eyes and a firm handshake, began saving Richard a spot. You show up, you work hard, you don't complain, Carl said one morning. That's rarer than you'd think. The work was monotonous, scanning, counting, recording, but Richard found peace in it. No board meetings, no hostile takeovers, no decisions that would destroy thousands of jobs. Just boxes and numbers and the satisfaction of honest labor. You're different from the others, Carl observed during a break. Educated, right? Once upon a time. What happened? Richard thought about how to answer. I chose a different path. Most people don't choose to end up here. Most people don't. But I did. Carl studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, whatever your story is, I've got steady work if you want it. 3 days a week guaranteed. More when we're busy. $80 a day. It was minimum wage, less than Richard used to spend on a single lunch, but it meant survival. It meant medicine for Denise, food for the children, maybe even catching up on rent eventually. Thank you, Richard said, meaning it more than any $1 million deal he'd ever closed. That evening, he returned to find Jamal teaching Keisha multiplication at their camp, using stones and sticks to illustrate the problems. The boy was patient, encouraging, never showing frustration when his sister struggled. "You're a good teacher," Richard said. "Had to be. Mom was too sick to help with homework, and Keisha's smart. She just needs someone to show her things right." Richard watched them work, remembering how he'd hired tutors for Sarah, thrown money at her education without ever sitting down to help her himself. Another regret in a lifetime of them. "I could help," he offered. "I was good at math once." Jamal grinned. "Yeah? Prove it." They spent the evening doing mathematics on cardboard with charcoal from their fire, Richard teaching both children tricks he'd learned in his MBA program. Keisha laughed when he showed her how to multiply by 11 in her head, delighted by the pattern. "You're smart, Uncle Richard," she said, the title coming naturally. Uncle Richard. He'd been called CEO, billionaire, visionary. But Uncle Richard hit different, warm and real in a way his former titles never had. The next few days brought small victories. Richard's steady work meant consistent money. Jamal returned to school, though he worried constantly about his mother. Keisha smiled more, especially when they managed to get her a new coat from the donation bin that almost fit. But visibility came with consequences. Richard was walking back from the warehouse when he heard his name called. Two men stood there, one with a camera, the other holding a digital recorder. "Richard Hale, the billionaire? We're from the Tribune. Can you confirm?" Richard turned and walked quickly away, but they followed. "Is it true you gave away $10 billion? Are you really homeless? What made you?" "No comment," Richard said, walking faster. But they got in their photos. The next morning, the story broke. "Billionaire living as homeless man," the headline screamed. The article was sensationalist, focusing on his fall rather than his reasons. There were quotes from David Kellerman expressing concern for Richard's mental health, and from board members suggesting he'd had a breakdown. Worse were the photos. Richard in his dirty clothes, beard unkempt, looking every inch the cautionary tale they wanted him to be. At the warehouse, Carl pulled him aside. "This true?" He held up the newspaper. "Does it matter?" "Not to me. You work hard, that's all I care about." But corporate's different. They're worried about liability, having someone famous or formerly famous or whatever working here. "Are you firing me?" "No, but I have to move you to night shift. Less visible. Same pay, but harder hours. Can you handle it?" Night shift meant 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It meant not being there when Keisha had nightmares, not helping Jamal with morning routines. But it meant keeping the job. "I can handle it." The first night shift was brutal. The warehouse became a different place in darkness, filled with shadows and the hollow echo of machinery. Richard's body, already pushed to its limits, screamed in protest at the reverse schedule. But he persisted, thinking of Denise in her hospital bed, of Jamal trying to be a man at 12, of Keisha's trusting eyes calling him Uncle Richard. On his break at 3 a.m., he found another night shift worker sitting outside, smoking. The man was younger, maybe 30, with tired eyes and calloused hands. "You're the billionaire," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Former billionaire. Why'd you do it? Get all up?" Richard considered the question. "Because I had everything and felt nothing. Now I have nothing and feel everything." The man laughed bitterly. "That's some philosophical bullshit. You know what I'd do with $1 billion? Buy my kid the surgery he needs. Pay off my mom's house. Make sure my family never worried again. And then, there is no then. That would be enough." Richard nodded. "You're right. That would be enough. I just took 50 years to figure that out." Word of Richard's identity spread through the homeless community like wildfire. Some were angry. He'd chosen what they were forced into. Others were curious. A few were hostile, seeing him as poverty tourism. But Jamal shut down any criticism quickly. "He's here, isn't he?" the boy said to a group of doubters. "He works, he shares what he has, he helps people. What he was before doesn't matter. What he does now does. Easy for you to say, kid. He's helping your family. He helped Sandra get to the clinic when her leg got infected. He taught Tommy's kids math. He gave his last $5 to Marcus for bus fare to that job interview. Yeah, he helps us, but he helps everyone. That's more than most people do, rich or poor." The crowd dispersed, but the tension remained. Richard had become a curiosity, a symbol, a controversy, Everything except what he wanted to be. Just another human trying to help. The reporters wouldn't leave them alone. They lingered outside the hospital, followed Jamal to school, even showed up at the warehouse despite Carl's attempts to keep them out. Each one of the exclusive, the real story of why Richard Hale threw away billions. Mr. Hale, just one interview, a young reporter pleaded. Tell your side of the story. There's no story, Richard insisted, loading boxes onto pallets. Just life. But the media didn't want life, they wanted drama. And when Richard wouldn't provide it, they created their own. The articles grew more sensational. Mental breakdown of a billionaire. The man who lost everything, by choice. One particularly vicious piece suggested Richard was running from legal troubles, that his charity was a cover for embezzlement. The attention brought unexpected visitors. Sarah appeared at the warehouse one night, dressed down but still looking like money in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. Dad! Richard froze, a box in his arms. They hadn't spoken since she'd returned her key months ago. Hello, Sarah. She looked around the warehouse, taking in his dirty uniform, his exhausted face, the other workers avoiding eye contact out of respect for his privacy. My God, it's all true. You really did this. I did. Why? Was our fight the reason? No, squeakfart. It was a catalyst. Maybe, but the reason was me. I was empty, and I was making everyone around me empty too. So you decided to become this? She gestured at his appearance. I decided to become human. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Dad, this is insane. You need help. Come with me. I have room in my apartment. We can get you cleaned up, see a doctor. I don't need a doctor. I need to be here. Here? In a warehouse? On the streets? With people who need me. Who I can actually help. You could help more people with your money. Could I? I had billions and helped no one. Now I have nothing, and he thought of Denise, still alive because of medicine he'd helped buy, of Jamal in school instead of working, of Keisha feeling safe. Now I help who I can. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. The man I talked to, David Kellerman, he says you're sick, that you need intervention. David wants to ease his conscience. If I'm crazy, then destroying my company for profit makes sense. Dad, please. Mom wouldn't want this for you. The mention of Emma stopped him cold. Your mother wanted me to live. Really live. For the first time since she died, I am. Sarah pulled out an envelope. I brought this. It's not much, but give it to the free clinic on 3rd Avenue. They need it more than I do. She left crying, and Richard returned to his shift, hands shaking. Seeing her had ripped open wounds he'd thought were healing. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not when Jamal and Keisha needed him. The real betrayal came from within their own community. Marcus, a man who'd been friendly enough when Richard first arrived on the streets, had been watching, calculating. He'd seen the reporters, heard the rumors about reward money for exclusive information. Richard returned from his shift one morning to find their camp surrounded by cameras. Marcus stood in the center, talking animatedly to a reporter. Yeah, he keeps money hidden, Marcus was saying. Thousands probably. Pretends to be poor, but he's got secret accounts. And the kid, Jamal, he's in on it. That's a lie, Jamal shouted, pushing through the crowd. Cameras swung toward him immediately, capturing his young face twisted with anger. Is it true your friend is Richard Hale? A reporter asked. Leave us alone. How much is he paying you to pretend? Richard stepped between them and a boy. Enough. You want a statement? Here it is. I gave away my fortune because money without purpose is meaningless. I work minimum wage. I sleep on the streets. And I found more meaning in the last 3 months than in 50 years of wealth. Now leave this child alone. But the damage was done. The story that ran the next day painted them as frauds. Richard as an eccentric billionaire playing at poverty. Jamal as a child actor hired for sympathy. They even published Jamal's mother's name and hospital. The hospital administration, already unhappy about the unpaid bills, used the attention as an excuse. We're transferring your mother to county, an administrator told Jamal coldly. It's better equipped for her situation. County was where people went to die. Everyone knew it. Underfunded, understaffed, overwhelmed. Please, Jamal begged. She's getting better here. The decision is made. Transport is this afternoon. Richard tried to intervene, but his name now carried stigma instead of power. The administrator looked at him with disgust. Mr. Hale, or whoever you are, please don't make this harder. We've already had to increase security because of the media attention you brought. They watched helplessly as Denise was loaded into an ambulance, too weak to protest, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her children. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. We'll follow you, Mom, Jamal promised. We'll be right there. But County was across the city, 2 hours by bus when the buses ran, impossible to reach during Richard's night shifts. The separation was devastating. That night, Jamal confronted Richard with pain raw in his voice. You lied to me. You were a billionaire. You had the power to save her, and you threw it away. Jamal, no, you let me think you were like us. But you're not. You chose this. We didn't get to choose. You're right. You chose. And I can't undo that choice. Why should I trust you? Why should I believe anything you say? Richard had no good answer. The boy was right. Every hardship they faced was one Richard had volunteered for, while Jamal had been born into it. I don't expect you to trust me, Richard said finally. But I'm not leaving. Whatever you think of me, I'm not walking away from you and Keisha. Jamal stared at him for a long moment, then his shoulders sagged. I'm scared she's going to die there. County is where people go to die, not your mother. She's a fighter. Even fighters lose sometimes. The media frenzy intensified. Someone leaked Richard's warehouse schedule, and reporters waited for him after every shift. Someone else, probably Marcus again, told them about Keisha, and suddenly child services appeared. We've received reports of a minor living in inadequate conditions, the social worker said, her clipboard at the ready. She's with her brother, Richard explained. Their mother is hospitalized. And who are you? A relative? A friend? I see. And where is this child sleeping? They couldn't lie. Too many people had seen their camp. The social worker's face grew increasingly grim as she took notes. I'll need to speak with the child. Keisha, frightened by the official attention, clung to Jamal. I want to stay with my brother. That may not be possible, sweetie. You need proper housing, regular meals, adult supervision. Richard watches us, Keisha said. He helps with homework and makes sure we eat. The social worker looked at Richard, unshaven, exhausted, clearly homeless, and her expression said everything. We'll be monitoring this situation, she said ominously. Any sign of neglect or danger, and we'll have to intervene. After she left, Jamal broke down. They're going to take her. They're going to split us up. No, Richard said firmly. We won't let that happen. How can we stop them? We have nothing. We are nothing. The same words Jamal had used before, but now they carried deeper desperation. The system was closing in on them from all sides. Hospital, child services, media, even their own community turned hostile by jealousy and suspicion. That night, unable to sleep, Richard walked to a payphone and did something he'd sworn he wouldn't. He called James Morrison, his former lawyer. James, it's Richard. Silence. Then, Jesus Christ, Richard. Do you know what the papers are saying? I need help. Not for me. There's a family. Richard, I can't. The liability, the media attention. My firm would crucify me. Just advice then. Off the record. How do I keep child services from separating these kids? James sighed. You need stable housing, proof of income, and a responsible adult guardian. Without those, the system wins. It always does. What if I became their guardian? You? Richard, you're homeless. No court would approve that. What if I wasn't? What if I got housing, kept my job? With what money? You gave it all away, remember? That grand gesture that everyone's calling either saintly or insane. There has to be a way. Richard, why? Why these kids? Why this family? Richard thought of Jamal's fierce protectiveness, Keisha's trust, Denise's quiet strength. Because they saved me. Now I need to save them. You can't save everyone, Richard. You couldn't even save your own family. The words cut deep because they were true. But Richard had learned something in his months on the streets. Sometimes you can't save everyone, but you save who you can. And sometimes that's enough. Thanks for your time, James. Richard, wait. There might be one option. The foundation you created. If you could prove hardship, apply for aid. The foundation has no idea who I am. That was the point. Then make them know. Swallow your pride and ask for help from your own money. After hanging up, Richard stood in the cold phone booth, watching his breath fog the glass. Pride. He'd given away billions, but kept his pride. Maybe it was time to give that away too. The next morning brought more bad news. The warehouse was cutting shifts, the negative publicity making corporate nervous. Carl apologetically reduced Richard to 2 days a week. I fought for you, Carl said, but they're scared of the attention. 2 days meant $40 less per week. $40 that could buy medicine, food, bus fare to see Denise. Every dollar mattered when you had none. Jamal hadn't spoken much since their fight, but that evening he found Richard and said quietly, I'm sorry for what I said. You had every right to say it. No, you're here. Whatever you were before, you're here now. That's what matters. They sat together watching Keisha play with some other children, her laughter a bright spot in the gathering darkness. We're losing everything, Jamal said matter-of-factly. Mom, maybe Keisha, our spot here once Marcus turned everyone against us. We haven't lost yet. You got a plan? Richard thought about the foundation, about swallowing pride, about the impossible math of poverty where every solution created 2 new problems. Maybe. It means admitting some things I don't want to admit. Like what? Like maybe I can't do this alone. Like maybe I need help. Jamal smiled slightly. Welcome to the club. Nobody survives alone out here. That night, Richard made a decision. He would approach the foundation, reveal himself, and beg if necessary. Not for himself, but for Denise dying in county, for Jamal trying to be a man too soon, for Keisha, who deserved a childhood. He'd given away his money to find meaning. Now he'd give away his pride to preserve it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd thrown away billions to learn what Jamal had always known. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what's worth fighting for. The office building that housed the Hale Foundation stood like a monument to Richard's former life. 40 stories of glass and steel in the financial district. Richard stood across the street for an hour, watching people in expensive suits flow in and out, before finally forcing himself to cross. The lobby was all marble and modern art, including a piece he recognized. He bought at auction 5 years ago for $3 million. Now it watched him with abstract eyes as he approached the security desk in his threadbare clothes. I need to speak with someone at the Hale Foundation, he said. The security guard looked him up and down. Do you have an appointment? No, but they don't take walk-ins. You can apply for aid online. I don't have computer access. Please, if I could just speak to someone. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Richard was escorted out, adding one more small humiliation to his collection. But Keisha's face, Jamal's exhaustion, and Denise dying alone at county pushed him forward. He found a library with computer access, swallowed his pride, and filled out the foundation's application. Every question felt like another piece of his dignity stripped away. Annual income, $640. Housing status, homeless. Reason for request, family medical emergency. At the bottom, a box asked for additional information. Richard stared at the blinking cursor, then typed, My name is Richard Hale. I created this foundation 4 months ago with the complete liquidation of my assets. I am now homeless, caring for 2 children whose mother is dying. I know the irony of asking my own money for help, but I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for them. He hit submit before he could change his mind. The response came faster than expected. The next day, Jamal found him at their camp with news. Someone from a foundation called the hospital. They're covering Mom's treatment, all of it. Moving her to a better room, getting her specialized care. They said someone anonymous arranged it. Richard kept his face neutral. That's wonderful. It doesn't make sense. Why would some random foundation help us? Maybe someone saw the news stories and wanted to help. Jamal studied him suspiciously, but said nothing more. 3 days later, a woman appeared at the warehouse during Richard's shift. She was young, professional, with intelligent eyes that reminded him of Sarah. Mr. Hale? I'm Jennifer Patterson from the Hale Foundation. Carl let them use his office for privacy. Jennifer spread papers on the desk, her expression unreadable. Your application was unusual, she began. We verified your identity, which was shocking enough. But what you're doing now, living like this by choice. It stopped being a choice months ago. Now it's just life. The board is divided. Some think this is elaborate manipulation. Others think you had a breakdown. A few think you might be genuinely trying to help this family. What do you think? She studied him for a long moment. I think you look exhausted. I think those children you mentioned mean everything to you. And I think you're telling the truth. So you'll help. We already have. Mrs. Washington's medical bills are covered. We've also arranged for a housing voucher that will give them a 2-bedroom apartment, paid for 6 months while she recovers. Richard's throat tightened. Thank you. There's a condition. Of course there was. There always was. The board wants to meet with you. Some members want proof you're mentally competent. Others want to understand why you did this. If you refuse, the aid continues. We won't punish the family. But future help would be complicated. When? Tomorrow. 2 o'clock. The conference room on the top floor. The top floor, where he'd once made decisions that moved markets. Now he'd return as a beggar. I'll be there. That night, Richard told Jamal about the apartment. 6 months rent-free. The boy was suspicious. What's the catch? No catch. The foundation wants to help. Foundations don't just help without wanting something. This one does. Jamal's eyes narrowed. You did something. Made some deal. I asked for help. That's all. You don't ask for help. You barely accept it when it's offered. I'm learning. They went to county hospital to tell Denise. She was already improved, the better medications and care showing results. When they explained about the apartment, she cried. I can't accept this. It's too much. Mom, please, Jamal begged. Just this once, let someone help us. She looked at Richard. This is you, isn't it? Somehow this is you. It's people who want to help. Does it matter who? Yes, because I need to know what it costs you. Nothing that matters compared to what it gives you. The next day, Richard stood in a bathroom at a fast food restaurant, trying to make himself presentable. He'd washed his hair in the sink, trimmed his beard with borrowed scissors, put on the cleanest clothes he had. He still looked homeless, just a slightly neater version. The foundation's conference room was filled with familiar faces. Not people he knew personally, but the type he knew intimately. Wealthy, powerful, comfortable in their expensive suits, and certain of their importance. They looked at him like he was an exotic animal. Richard, the board president, began. We need to understand. Was this performance art? A breakdown? Some complex tax scheme? It was supposed to be a search for meaning. And you found it in homelessness? I found it in a 12-year-old boy who takes care of his dying mother. In his 8-year-old sister who still laughs despite everything. In their mother who worked herself literally to death, trying to keep them safe. So this family, they're special somehow? Richard thought about it. No, that's the point. They're not special. There are thousands of families just like them, struggling and dying while we sit in conference rooms debating whether they deserve help. They're ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship with grace I never had when I was wealthy. You could have helped more people by keeping your fortune and using it wisely. Could I? I had billions for decades. How many people did I help? How many jobs did I cut? How many families did I destroy in the name of efficiency? An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. What do you want from us? Someone finally asked. I want you to help them. Not because they're special, but because they're human. I want the foundation to remember that every number in your spreadsheets represents someone's mother, someone's child. And what about you? Do you want to return to this world? Richard looked around the conference room. The leather chairs he'd once found comfortable, the view he'd once thought impressive, the power that had once seemed important. No, this isn't my world anymore. Then what is? A 12-year-old boy who taught me that dignity matters more than dollars. That's my world now. They granted the aid, full medical care for Denise, the apartment, even education funds for both children. Richard signed papers agreeing to periodic check-ins to prove the money was being used properly, a humiliation he accepted gladly. As he was leaving, Jennifer stopped him. The board doesn't understand, but I do. You found something worth more than money. I found a family. Your daughter Sarah asked us to give you this. She handed him an envelope. She said you'd refuse it from her, but maybe you'd accept it from us. Inside was $5,000 cash and a note. For the boy who taught you what I couldn't. S. Richard stood in that marble lobby, holding more money than he'd seen in months. And for the first time since giving away his fortune, he cried. But the money created a new problem. Returning to camp with $5,000 was dangerous. Marcus and others were watching, resentful, potentially violent. And Jamal would ask questions Richard wasn't ready to answer. He made a decision that would have been unthinkable months ago. He went to a cheap motel and rented a room for a week. Not for himself, but as a safe place to transition the family from the streets to their new apartment. When he brought Jamal and Keisha to the motel, the boy was speechless. That was all he managed. The foundation gave a transition grant. Until the apartment is ready. This is too much. People don't just. Sometimes they do. Sometimes miracles happen. Keisha jumped on the bed, laughing at the bounce. And for a moment, she was just a normal 8-year-old girl, not a child aged by poverty. That night, with both children asleep in real beds, Jamal said quietly, "You were rich, weren't you? Before." "Yes." "How rich?" "Very. Billions." Richard nodded. "And you gave it all up?" "Yes." "For this?" "For us." "Not at first. At first, I gave it up for me. To feel something. But now, yes. For you." Jamal was quiet for a long time. Then, "That's either the stupidest or the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Can it be both?" "Yeah, I guess it can." The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was really just a corner of the living room. But to the Washington family, it was a palace. Denise came home from the hospital weak, but improving, crying when she saw the space. "It's ours," she kept asking. "Really ours?" "For 6 months guaranteed," Jamal told her. "After that, we'll figure it out." "We always do," Keisha added, mimicking her brother's confidence. Richard helped them move in, which took all of an hour since they owned almost nothing. The foundation had provided basic furniture, and various charities had contributed clothes, dishes, linens. It was more than they'd had in years. "You'll stay, won't you?" Denise asked Richard. "The couch pulls out. This is your home, your family space." "You are family," Keisha insisted. "Uncle Richard belongs here." But Richard knew the truth. His presence would complicate things. Child services was already suspicious. The media still occasionally sniffed around. And Jamal needed to be a child again, not his mother's caretaker or Richard's guide to poverty. "I'll visit every day," he promised. "But you need to be a family without worrying about me." He found a room at a boarding house, paid for with part of Sarah's money. It was small, dingy, but it had a door that locked and a shower that worked. Luxury by his recent standards. The warehouse job continued, and Carl even added a 3rd day back once the media attention died down. Richard worked his shifts, saved his money, and spent his free time with the Washingtons, helping with homework, teaching Jamal advanced mathematics, reading to Keisha. Denise grew stronger week by week. The proper medication, regular food, and stable housing worked miracles her children had stopped believing in. "I might be able to work again," she said one evening, hope in her voice for the first time in years. "Part-time at first, but something." "Don't push too hard, Mom," Jamal warned. "I'm not, but I want to contribute. I want to feel useful again." Richard understood that need intimately. 1 month into their new stability, Jennifer from the foundation visited to check on them. She found Denise walking without assistance, Keisha thriving in school, Jamal acting like the teenager he was supposed to be. "The board is impressed," she told Richard privately. "They want to know if you'd consider working with the foundation, identifying families who need help, verifying their situations. You know what to look for. You want me to be a poverty inspector? I want you to be a bridge between the world that has and the world that needs." It would mean steady income, purpose, a way to help beyond just the Washingtons. But it would also mean returning partially to the world he'd left. "Can I think about it?" "Of course." That evening, he discussed it with Jamal as they sat on the apartment's small balcony, watching the city lights. "You should do it," the boy said immediately. "It means going back to that world. Meetings, reports, bureaucracy. But for a good reason this time. To help people like us. I don't know if I can trust myself with even a little power again." Jamal looked at him seriously. "You're not the same person who had billions. That guy wouldn't have lasted 1 night on the streets. You're Richard, who knows what hunger feels like, who knows what it's like to be invisible, who knows that dignity matters more than dollars. That Richard can be trusted. When did you become so wise? Birth. I came out giving advice. They laughed, and Richard realized it was the first time in months he'd laughed without weight behind it. Sarah visited the next week. She came to the apartment, bringing gifts for the children, books for Jamal, art supplies for Keisha. She was tentative around Richard, unsure how to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. "You look better," she said carefully. "Healthier, regular meals, and sleep help. Dad, I'm getting married next month." "I know. I saw the announcement. I want you there." Richard looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure? Mom would want you there. And I want you there. The real you, not the businessman you used to pretend to be. I don't exactly have wedding-appropriate clothes. We'll figure that out. Will you come? If you really want me there, yes." She hugged him then, the first real contact they'd had in over a year. She smelled like expensive perfume, but underneath was the same little girl who'd once fallen asleep in his arms reading bedtime stories, back before the money became everything. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "It took courage to change. It took losing everything to realize I had nothing." "No, you had everything. You just couldn't see it until you gave it away." The foundation job started small, 3 days a week, visiting families who'd applied for aid, verifying their situations, making recommendations. Richard was good at it. He could spot real need versus scams, understood the difference between temporary crisis and systemic poverty, knew which families would use help to build something better and which were too broken to do more than survive. But more importantly, he could sit with these families without judgment, share their cheap coffee or tea, and make them feel seen. He knew what it was like to be invisible. "You're different from the others they send," one mother told him. "You don't look at us like we're statistics. You're not statistics. You're people. Most folks with clipboards don't remember that." The wedding was held in a garden venue outside the city. Richard wore a suit borrowed from the foundation's clothing program. Not expensive, but clean and properly fitted. He sat in the second row, watching his daughter marry a man who looked at her the way Richard should have looked at Emma all those years. At the reception, he found himself at a table with Jamal, Keisha, and Denise, whom Sarah had insisted on inviting. "Your daughter is beautiful," Denise said. "She has your eyes, but her mother's spirit. You knew Emma?" "No, but I can see her in Sarah. The kindness, the strength. Those don't come from nowhere." During the father-daughter dance, Sarah had arranged for the DJ to play a song Richard recognized. One Emma used to sing to Sarah when she was small. They danced, and Richard whispered, "Your mother would be so proud." "Are you?" "Proud. More than you'll ever know. I love you, Dad. The real you, not the billionaire, not the broken man on the streets, but the father who finally learned what matters." 6 months passed. Denise was working part-time as a teacher's aide. Jamal was excelling in school, talking about college possibilities. Keisha had joined an art program and showed real talent. The apartment assistance was ending, but between Denise's job and Richard's foundation salary, they could afford to keep it. Richard had moved to a better room, though still modest. He had few possessions, some clothes, books, a photo Sarah had given him of Emma. He didn't need more. One evening, the Washingtons invited him for dinner to celebrate Jamal's 13th birthday. It was a simple meal, spaghetti, garlic bread, a cake from the grocery store. But the apartment was full of laughter, warmth, and something Richard had rarely felt in his penthouse: love without conditions. "Make a wish," Denise told Jamal as he prepared to blow out the candles. The boy closed his eyes, then opened them and looked directly at Richard. "I wish for family to stay family, no matter what." He blew out the candles, and Keisha cheered. Denise cut the cake while Jamal opened his presents. Mostly practical things like school supplies and clothes, but he acted like each was a treasure. "I have something for you," Richard said, pulling out an envelope. Inside was a letter from a prestigious prep school, full scholarship approval for exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation had connections, and Richard had made the recommendation. Jamal stared at the letter, speechless. "You don't have to go," Richard said quickly. "It's just an option. But you're brilliant, and you deserve every opportunity." Jamal hugged him, cutting off the words. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Later, as they sat on a balcony watching the city lights, Jamal said, "You had money but no life. Now you've got life, even without the money." Richard nodded, speechless at the truth of it. "That's what you taught me," Jamal continued. "That being rich isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about who's in your life. You taught me that, not the other way around." Maybe we taught each other. They sat in comfortable silence, uncle and nephew by choice rather than blood. Proof that family isn't always about DNA, but about who shows up when life falls apart. Richard thought about his journey, from penthouse to pavement, from billions to boarding houses, from power to purpose. He'd given away everything to find meaning and discovered it in a 12-year-old boy's wisdom, an 8-year-old girl's trust, and a sick mother's dignity. The greatest wealth, he now understood, wasn't in numbered accounts or stock portfolios. It was in Keisha calling him Uncle Richard, in Denise trusting him with her children, in Jamal seeing him not as a former billionaire, but as family. He'd once built towers that touched the sky. Now he was helping build something more valuable. Lives, futures, hope. The towers would eventually crumble, but what he was building now would last generations. "Hey, Richard," Jamal said suddenly. "Was it worth it? Giving up everything?" Richard looked at the boy who'd taught him more than any Harvard professor or board advisor ever had. This child who'd shared his sandwich with a stranger, who'd stood up to bullies for him, who'd shown him that survival with dignity was its own form of wealth. "Ask me that question differently," Richard said. "How?" "Ask me if keeping the money would have been worth never meeting you." Jamal smiled, understanding. It was worth it. It was worth everything. As the city sparkled below them, Richard realized the truth of his words. He'd given up $10 billion and gained something priceless. The knowledge that real wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in the lives you touch and the people who choose to love you when you have nothing left to give but yourself. The billionaire was gone, but Richard had never been richer. If you had to choose between keeping your comfort while feeling empty inside or losing everything to find genuine human connection, which would you choose? And would you have the courage to actually do it? If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge us to see beyond the surface.